Okay. All right. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you. So, good morning. And then also good afternoon to whoever is live streaming, attending through the live stream. And also some of us maybe good evening and late good night as well. Welcome to the 5th Bernard Luk Memorial Lecture in Hong Kong Studies. My name is Wong, and I'm from the School of Social Work at York University and also the chair of the Bernard Luk Memorial Lecture in Hong Kong Studies Committee currently. So I will be moderating the event today, and we are very, very honored to have Professor Ching Lee to be our speaker today, and also we have two discussants, Winnie and also Vincent Wong, and they will together share their insights on the topic envisioning Hong Kong studies, envisioning global Hong Kong studies, possibilities, politics, and praxis. So before we introduce our speaker, I would first like to very quickly go over some logistics. Due to an unexpected change of Professor Lee's flight schedule, so we regret that we need to cut short the event today by maybe 15 minutes or so, so we'll end approximately 12:45 instead of 1 p.m. Together with what we see here in person, we also have close to 240 registrants attending virtually live stream. So they are somewhere around the world, all over many countries in Asia, in Europe, and also North America. So the session today is not recorded. So we ask everyone, especially those who are attending virtually, not to record, not to duplicate, and for the virtual attendees, also not to screenshot today's session. Please do not quote without permission from the speakers, and so thank you for your understanding and cooperation. For our in-person audience here, thank you so much for showing up, and so lovely to see everyone in person. Our YCAR staff, Alex, he will be taking pictures, but he will only be taking photos from the back. Only at the beginning. So unless you absolutely do not even want your back to be in the photo, let us know, okay? So now I would like to first invite Maria Lau, the director of this very nice library, a very important library, Canada-Hong Kong Library at U of T, being the co-sponsor of this event. So she will do the land acknowledgement and also some opening remarks. And then after that, our YCAR, York Center for Asian Research at York, Aberdeen Kusno will also give his opening remarks, and then Gordon Anderson, who is the coordinator of East Asian Studies program, also at York University, will introduce the speaker. So, Maria.
Professor C.K. Lee, Aberdeen Kusno, Gordon Anderson, Rita Wong, members of the Bernard Luk Memorial Lecture Committee, and everyone who are attending this lecture in person or via video streaming, greetings. On behalf of Mr. Larry Alford, Chief University Librarian of the University of Toronto Libraries, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to each of you joining us online or coming to the Richard Charles Lee Canada Hong Kong Library at the Robust. Before I begin, I would like to make an acknowledgement of traditional land. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The history of Richard Charles Lee Canada Hong Kong Library represents 3 decades of dedicated hard work, commitment, generosity, and vision. It grows from a humble resource center in 1990 to become the largest Hong Kong studies collection outside the city of Hong Kong. Today, the collection stands at nearly 80,000 volumes of books, 2,500 periodicals, and more. However, we are yet to be comprehensive, but we are grateful. Passion is vision in action, and thanks to Professor Bernard Luk, who started the collection and passionately building it tirelessly here in Toronto and in his many trips back in Hong Kong. The fabulous effort was continued by my predecessor, Mr. Yang Kok Hong, and Dr. Jack Leung, who is with us today. This distinctive collection that many of us are truly proud of will continue to grow and, more importantly, to serve the community at Toronto, the Hong Kong diaspora, and we welcome students and scholars across Canada and beyond. I'm delighted that the lecture is held at the Richard Charles Lee Canada Hong Kong Library today. It is a well-designed gathering hub with a fine balance between form and function, fitting for cultural and intellectual endeavors. Your presence today, virtually or physically, is greatly valued here. It adds strength to our space. It gives us wings to fly and continue to be the great good place to meet and congregate on all aspects of Hong Kong and Canadian Chinese studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you all for attending the 5th Bernard Luk Memorial Lecture today in this special library here. It is an honor for me to have the occasions of saying a few words every year for this distinguished event. It would seem redundant for me to remind everyone who was Professor Bernard Luk. Nevertheless, let me just mention that Professor Bernard Luk was an internationally recognized authority on the history of Hong Kong. He taught at U.of from 1992 until his death. The Bernard Luk Memorial Lecture in Hong Kong Studies was created in 2016 thanks to the endowment fund set up by Dr. Vivian Poi, who is Professor Luk's friend and a former student, in honor of this distinguished scholar. It is the most fitting tribute, as the lecture itself represents Professor Luk's lifetime intellectual inquiries and struggles for Hong Kong. I joined U.of the year Professor Luk passed away, so I didn't get a chance to say hi to him. So this event is special for me, as it has given me the occasion to get to know Professor Luk every year by remembering him, his work, and his time. I still remember when I gave my first remark 5 years ago, I wasn't quite sure how I should represent Hong Kong that matches the spirit of Bernard Luk's memorial lecture. I was wondering how we can think about global Hong Kong when the local or locality has been so central to Hong Kong's struggles for its place in the shifting geopolitical world. What would Professor Luk say about globalization, about Hong Kong studies today? And just yesterday, in my annual remembering of Professor Luk, I found an article by him where he mentioned globalization. I'm sure Professor Lee will talk more about this subject. Now let me quote from Professor Luk. In an age of globalizations, when the interplay between the local and the global is of utmost importance, it is vital for researchers to be well versed in both dimensions. One cannot perform credibly and effectively without due regards for both the local and global dimensions of most issues, end quote. This was from 2006 when he was asked to discuss about the relationship between area studies and disciplines. Yeah. And I have also been reminded by a very effective and moving obituary co-authored by Renita Wong and colleagues at U.of, and also by Bernard's friends, that, and I quote, "One of his last activities was serving as coordinator of the East Asian Studies program at York University during its review," end quote. This is really someone who is so committed, to thinking, to establishing, strong East Asian Studies program, and more specifically, Hong Kong studies. So this basically reminds us of how important it is for us to strengthen our community by way of strengthening East Asian studies, and particularly Hong Kong studies in Canada and in everywhere. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Renita for so wonderfully chairing the Hong Kong Studies Committee, which now I think includes Maria, I believe, and maybe also other friends from University of Toronto. So I thank all the members, Susan Henders, Jack Leong, Gita Man, Wendy Wong, and Maria Lau, if you are joining the committee now. Yes. So thank you all. Yeah, thank you all for doing such an amazing work. And of course, I want to thank YCA's coordinator, Alicia Filipovic, at the back over there, and Alex Felipe, who is taking pictures for us. And I also want to thank our speaker, Professor Ching Kwan, and our discussions, Professor Winnie Wong, from Toronto Metropolitan University. Oh, I'm sorry, my apology, Professor Winnie Ng. Thank you. And also our doctoral candidate, Vincent Wong, from Osgoode Law School at York University. Thank you all for being with us today, and have a nice conversation. Thank you. To you, Gordon.
Okay, now that he's covered pretty much half of what I was going to say, and appreciative of the fact that we are limited for time, I would like to give a big shout out to Renita, who is constantly badgering me, well, are you ready? Are you going to join? Et cetera, and who are you, et cetera, et cetera. I'm here to introduce Professor Lee. Professor Lee is a sociologist whose interests are in global and comparative issues, particularly in work, globalization, comparative ethnology, with focus on Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, and I believe more specifically southern China, and Africa. According to her bio, her earlier monographs form a trilogy of Chinese capitalism through the lens of labor and working class experiences. Her recent research publications include co-editing Take Back Our Future, an eventful sociology of the Hong Kong umbrella movement, Cornell University Press, 2019, and The Social Question in the 21st Century, A Global View, University of California Press, 2019. Her book, Hong Kong, Global China's Restive Frontier, is due to be published this year, I believe, right? Cambridge University Press. In a recent interview, Professor Lee stated, and I quote, the book I am working on begins with an ethnography of the 2019 anti-extradition bill movement, focusing on what I found to be revolutionary in the context of Hong Kong's history. I will then historicize the ethnography with what Foucault calls a history of the present, identifying not the chronological origin of the movement, but rather traces of past practices and power mechanisms that continue to configure the present. If I succeed, meaning Professor Lee, I will hopefully offer a critical understanding of how British and Chinese colonialisms have constituted the fundamental category of the political in Hong Kong, how 2019 represented an epistemic and experiential breakthrough of those legacies, or if you will, burdens, not so much among academics, but among the people. And before ceding the floor to Professor Lee, I will leave you with her concluding words from the same interview. Among the many innovative and insightful slogans during the 2019 protests, there is one that resonates with me most. Ideas are bulletproof. As we witness movements, institutions, and organizations being crushed every day, it is all the more important that we protect this line of defense. Professor Lee.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me well? The recording? Okay, great. Thank you very much, Gordon, for this wonderful introduction, and for Renita for bringing me here. She and I went back, I don't know, 3-4 decades when we were both very young at Chinese U of Hong Kong and studying sociology. And I could feel that Bernard is with us today, and so I think it's appropriate for me to share one memory that with you about my brief encounter with him. I arrived in Hong Kong while I was writing my dissertation before I got my PhD. It was right around 1992, the time when he left, right before he left Hong Kong for Toronto. And he was asking me, he was very kind to junior scholars like myself, and so he was interested in what my dissertation was about. So I explained to him it was about factory regimes in Hong Kong as well as Shenzhen. I was studying the movement of Hong Kong industries and the workers there and management politics as this last generation of Hong Kong industrialists manage factories across the border. So I have two cases for comparison, how both these two regimes managed the women workers. And I told him that I actually worked as a factory worker across the border in both factories. And he laughed. And he said, so you pose as a factory worker, as if I tried to deceive people. And I had to explain to him this idea of informed consent, that we have to get the consent of the people we study before we can hang out with them. And I remember it was a dinner. It was the first time that in my life that I tasted one of his favorite dishes. Guess what is that favorite dish? It's a Taiwanese cuisine, 3-cup chicken. I don't know whether this is really his favorite dish, but that's what he ordered. Anyway, so, and since then, I didn't have the chance to talk to him much because he left. But every year, I remember I received that, the digital greeting card. I'm sure many of you have received it. So he's a very warm-hearted person. And I'm so glad I have this chance, thanks to Renita, to come to this library, which is part of his legacy. So, but remembering him also remind myself that I actually started my academic career with a study about Hong Kong, or at least half of the case of that study was about Hong Kong. The other half was the factory regime in South China, which at that time was becoming the world's manufacturing hub. China was emerging as the workshop of the world. And so I was interested in the kind of labor relations, worker politics that facilitated that rise, that enabled that rise. But since then, I've moved on to look mostly at China's development without any Hong Kong component until 2014, when the umbrella movement broke out, and more recently 2019, when the protest just was so revelatory, and I used the term revolutionary in my understanding of Hong Kong. So I'm moving back home after all these years, 3 decades, studying something else, including China in Africa. But I'll mention some of the parallels between Africa and Hong Kong if I have the time. But today, Renita gave me this topic. I didn't choose this topic, and I'm glad she assigned it to me, because that really got me thinking about how, at this particular moment in time, people who are interested in Hong Kong academics doing Hong Kong studies, how to deal with what I would consider both an intellectual but also a kind of existential crisis or dilemma, which is how to make Hong Kong studies and Hong Kong itself relevant and significant globally. Obviously, Hong Kong studies have existed for a long time. In Hong Kong, most people are doing Hong Kong studies. But at this particular moment, I think we need to collectively maybe brainstorm and discuss how to move Hong Kong onto another plane of relevance and significance because of the many conditions and challenges that Hong Kong is facing, and we know what they are. And so I think for me today, I mean, being given this topic is very important because it's something I have to think about as I'm writing. I'm still writing another book, a second book on the movement itself, something that Gordon mentions in his introduction. So how can I put that into practice in my own work? And so I really take up the challenge of this talk because I would like to invite you to think with me and to explore this idea of global Hong Kong studies. I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't have a definitive answer. I would propose something based on the work that my colleagues in Hong Kong studies, in Hong Kong, many of them are based in Hong Kong, have done over the past decades, which amount to a really fabulous, solid literature on Hong Kong with global implications. But I was also thinking of maybe there are other ways as well of making Hong Kong studies globally significant. And so this is a disclaimer for this talk that I have no audacity to give the definitive word about what global Hong Kong studies is. I'm just inviting you to have a dialogue, a conversation about what it can be and how we can proceed. And I would suggest 3 possibilities for people who want to do Hong Kong study but indicate or illustrate Hong Kong's and the knowledge about Hong Kong, the relevance and the significance of this field of knowledge. Because in the interest of time, this is already 11:25, I will go through quite quickly and then allow more time for clarification at the end. The 3 possibilities are Hong Kong as a case, a theoretical case, Hong Kong outside in, as well as Hong Kong assemblage. And for each, I would illustrate that each approach comes packaged with some meta-theoretical assumptions about Hong Kong as a bounded entity, about the temporality of Hong Kong as a historical formation, as well as the subject position of Hong Kong itself. So pick your choose. I mean, but I want to sort of excavate these less discussed assumptions when we choose one of the 3 or combine some of these modalities of knowledge production. Okay, so the first way to make Hong Kong studies or knowledge about Hong Kong globally significant or relevant is by constituting that particular Hong Kong phenomenon as a case of a particular theoretical field. So constitute Hong Kong as a theoretical case. And many of my colleagues over the past many decades have tried to do so. The global significance in this approach comes from anchoring Hong Kong in a general field of theory, and oftentimes we use Hong Kong as a case to compare with another case to generate dialogue with theories. And this is a typical approach for social scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists. If you go down to the list, some things that you're very familiar with, if you are familiar with Hong Kong, that Hong Kong has been used as a case to illustrate some theory or theoretical discussions. This is among the first. As a scholar myself, as a student, in the 70s, the Chicago economists made Hong Kong very famous globally, famous case that he argued, Milton Friedman argues that Hong Kong was, or the Hong Kong economy was a textbook case of laissez-faire capitalism, laissez-faire market economy. So that's one way, you use the Hong Kong experience and then shed light on some general theory that goes beyond Hong Kong. And through doing that, make Hong Kong globally relevant. Many other examples. I'm not going to name names because otherwise I'll never get on my flight. There are so many people's names. And if I miss mentioning somebody, I feel bad. Anyway, so you know who they are. Scholars in Hong Kong write about Hong Kong as a global city, putting Hong Kong into the literature, vast literature, which has been so dominant since the 1990s. Less so now because it has become, common sense. But cities as nodes of capital accumulation, servicing global capital by rendering all kinds of services, and that's why in Hong Kong you see so many corporate headquarters. The making of Hong Kong as a global city. Another example, again, drawing from Hong Kong scholars, Hong Kong's democratization process. Use that experience, that trajectory, to put in dialogue with theories of democratization, to explain how, why, with modernization, other societies democratized, but Hong Kong, there are so many hurdles. What are the hurdles? What does these hurdles say about modernization theory, democratization theory? I have other colleagues study social movement, unionism, the weak so-called union movement. How does that diverge in Hong Kong, diverge from the typical cases in South Korea or South Africa? Hybrid regime, a conceptualization about the liberal-authoritarian system of rule in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is one particular case of this kind of hybrid regime, which is very widely used in political science. Again, using Hong Kong as a case of something, and therefore compare with other cases to illustrate what is specific about Hong Kong, putting Hong Kong in this global perspective. Global meaning a summation of many other cases, and theory, basically my understanding of theory is that kind of summation, the distillation of many, many cases into generalization, and you put Hong Kong in that generalization. More recently, people talk about digitized social movements. They have theories of those, and Hong Kong have experienced, at least since the umbrella movement in 2019, 2 of such concrete cases. And then, of course, theories about immigrant society, multi-ethnic society. We have scholars in Hong Kong studying exactly that. Now, what are the theoretical, meta-theoretical assumptions that come packaged with this approach to study Hong Kong globally? Most of these studies that construct Hong Kong as a case of a theoretical subject matter, they think of Hong Kong as a bounded spatial entity. The phenomenon they study happens within the borders of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong as a case sort of identifies Hong Kong as, I would say, reifies sometimes, that Hong Kong has a very clearly defined boundary, and what we're studying, when we talk about Hong Kong studies, we study what happens inside that boundary. Temporality is experimental. That is, we don't pay attention to Hong Kong as a historical formation having its own temporality. We don't care about the trajectory that Hong Kong has experienced. We take Hong Kong as what we would do in an experiment. You put it in a test tube. One case, you bracket its history, you bracket its historicity, you bracket its temporality, and compare it with Singapore. So time in this treatment, in this approach, is not problematized. It's nothing specific to Hong Kong time, which I'll come to in a minute. Is experimental, is abstract, is equivalent. One case, temporality is equivalent to the other. Basically, we abstract temporality from our understanding of Hong Kong so that you can do comparison. The subject position of Hong Kong in this approach is derivative. That is, we're interested in Hong Kong only because it is a case to serve our interest in theory. So theory takes priority in this approach. People would not admit it, but the way we write oftentimes uses Hong Kong as a case for the purpose of theory illustration or advancement. So I would say the subject of Hong Kong, despite being front and center as the empirical case, in the generation of knowledge, it is in service of some theoretical agenda. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that any of these three approaches, any one of them is better than the other. They're just different, and I think they're all legitimate. And depending on your disciplinary persuasions, training, and your own preference, and sense of importance, what speaks to you, you can pick and choose. And it's not my intention to impose any normative judgment and to prioritize them. But I think this is one of the most popular ways of treating Hong Kong as a case in order to highlight its theoretical and global significance. Now, the second approach is called what I call Hong Kong outside in, and I borrowed this concept from mostly social historians interested in migration studies, diaspora studies. But I think this approach also applies to people interested in macro political economy and trying to understand Hong Kong's development within that context. And this approach basically is seeing Hong Kong as constitutive of and by global forces, or what some people call master processes. So basically, you don't look inside Hong Kong as much as you would look from the outside in, from the perspective of these master processes, these global forces. And you see Hong Kong as part of the flow, as part of a node in these macro master processes of history. Outside in is this perspective that is quite distinct from, quite different from the first Hong Kong as a case. And I took it from the Duke anthropologist Anson Ho, who talks about diasporic studies, inter-Asian migration. And so in the field of inter-Asia, regional, or trans-Pacific migration, Hong Kong is a very important hub. I think I was told by Renita that Elizabeth Sin has talked, was the speaker in previous iteration of this lecture series. Her work, Pacific Crossing, I think, is called, is one example of that kind of putting, it's talking about Hong Kong, but Hong Kong as part of this macro process of trans-Pacific migration in the early 20th century. That outside include more than global migration. That outside includes capitalism, both in terms of capital movement as well as labor movement. So many anthropologists study Hong Kong's domestic workers as part of a global nanny chain, what they call nanny chain, that, domestic workers migrate from Southeast Asia or from elsewhere to Hong Kong and then on to Canada or to the Middle East. So you look at that migration of global domestic worker labor, you see Hong Kong as, again, one node in that process, or force, however you want to call it. Hong Kong has always, oftentimes, been compared or be situated among the tiger economy, sorry, not the dragon economy, tiger economies. When I was a grad student, the rise of East Asia, East Asian developmentalism, is important regional process whereby people study Hong Kong in the context of the regional takeoff of that economy in the shadow of the Cold War, especially U.S. role in promoting the tiger economies as containment, as part of its containment strategy against Chinese communism. So Hong Kong, again, not Hong Kong in and of itself, but Hong Kong from the outside, these broader processes in to understand Hong Kong. And in that way, you sort of discover Hong Kong as part of a global process, and therefore the global significance of Hong Kong studies come from this kind of historicizing and theorizing of Hong Kong within these broader processes. Colonialism is another global process that, of course, is worldwide. British colonialism, British Empire is the biggest in human history, and Hong Kong is just one of, again, a link in that empire. And tons of work have been written about Hong Kong experience as a British Empire, a member of within the British Empire. Collaborative colonialism, who are the compradors, both in terms of business and intellectuals, helping, facilitating the British rule over Chinese society. So they study Hong Kong, but in the context of colonialism. Myself, the book that is coming out is not about 2019. This book coming out is about putting Hong Kong in the broader process and phenomenon of global China. I came to Hong Kong, I went back to Hong Kong to teach for 2 years after I finished that book on China in Africa. I spent 7 years in Zambia to look at Chinese investment in the mines and in construction. I wrote that book. I thought I would go back to Hong Kong to have a break, take a break, and just rest up and teach and come to know my own city. And guess what? What I saw in Zambia, I find so many parallels in Hong Kong. Not because of the cities' economies are the same, they can't be more different, but because of the power processes that I find in Zambia, how China is using 3 kinds of power in Zambia. I find the same 3 kinds of power in Hong Kong, and that got me to think that actually, despite many people thinking, oh, Hong Kong is not part of global China because it's part of Chinese territories. When we think of global China as power mechanisms, you can see very clearly what China has been doing to Hong Kong is no different, although the effects are very different, but it belongs to the same global processes of projecting its power using some generic means of power that I find both in Africa and Hong Kong. So putting Hong Kong in this context of global China is another example of Hong Kong outside in. Now, what are the assumptions with this approach, Hong Kong outside in, is that compared to the first, you begin to see that Hong Kong is no longer a bounded entity. Hong Kong's boundaries become spatially more fluid because it's all connected to all these other bigger things. You can't really easily box Hong Kong into these territories because what we're interested in are those mechanisms, processes, and forces. Hong Kong is less a spatially fixed entity, less reified in this approach. Temporality-wise, it's no longer experimental or the equivalent of other cases. Here, the temporality of Hong Kong becomes the temporality of these macro processes. Capitalism has its own temporality. It is, if you read Marx, it's a linear progression from feudalism to what? To capitalism, socialism. There's a linear historical temporality inherent in theories of capitalism. And when you put Hong Kong in that temporality, you basically impose that temporality in your understanding of Hong Kong. So all these, colonialism has its own temporality, migration has its temporality, either circular temporality or linear or stepwise or whatever. So the temporality of Hong Kong in the second approach is still not the temporality of Hong Kong itself. It's the temporality of whatever theories is teleological, in whatever macro process you choose to put Hong Kong in. Because those theories, those macro processes usually come packaged with its own temporal understanding of history. where we're going, the directionality of time and development. In the second approach, Hong Kong is still not the subject, the real subject of inquiry. We use Hong Kong to understand broader processes. So in this sense, this second approach shares with the first approach, Hong Kong as a case, that Hong Kong is not really at the center of knowledge production. I think Hong Kong is being used not to serve theory generation, theorization, but to serve our understanding of history, broader history, global history. Local history is important, but it plays second fiddle to this primary historical narrative, capitalism, colonialism, whatever you like to write on. Then I come to the third, and I hope I'm not setting up your expectation too high, and I find, I come to this third, the best way to think about it and to overcome some of the perhaps shortcomings that I've detailed so far in the first two. No, but I think it's something I'm experimenting with my writing of this book I'm doing on 2019 and the broader historical context of 2019. So I may not be able to pull it off. I'm just here to give you some idea, and I would like to hear some critique and questioning so that I can really, incorporate that into my current work. As global assemblage, what I mean by this is to put Hong Kong, to find Hong Kong and defining Hong Kong as subject. And that means centering, theorizing, historicizing Hong Kong with local sensibilities. What I mean is we want to draw on our understanding of Hong Kong and what we think are important to Hong Kong and make it our motivation of knowledge, put it at the center, not as a derivative of theory or broader historical trends. And that would rely on us picking a topic that is not given to us by theory or by some historians studying macro processes. They have to be in the picture. But when we think of conceptualize or formulate a topic about Hong Kong, we should ground that, the first step of formulating a question, finding a Hong Kong study question based on our deep understanding, or if you will, indigenous understanding of Hong Kong, because only then could we achieve the goal that Habermas have talked about. It is knowledge for reflection, knowledge for emancipation. Now this emancipation thing is not like, emancipate labor, what is it? Geez, slipping. Slavery. It's not about emancipation of slaves. Emancipatory knowledge means that we improve on what we have. We try to find freedom, however you want to define it. But we want to move society forward. To generate that kind of knowledge for Hong Kong is for Hong Kong. It's not just about Hong Kong or use Hong Kong to build theory or to enrich our historical knowledge. As a critical resource for Hong Kong, we have to, I think, make use of our local knowledge. People who have local, you don't have to be born in Hong Kong to have local knowledge, but make use of local knowledge and also to see what is important for Hong Kong society to move forward. Make that our subject matter. That's what I mean by centering Hong Kong. And then to think about what is unique to Hong Kong. Well, I think Hong Kong is unique not because we have been a colony. Many societies have been colonies, not because we've been at the center of capitalism. Many global cities have been serving global capitalism. I think what is unique to Hong Kong is not that we can be used as a case to illustrate all these macro processes. What is unique is the articulation. It's how these processes come together and conflict with each other, context with each other, and how Hong Kong people find resolutions or not when these crisscrossing historical global processes meet in the place and time we call Hong Kong. And that is the uniqueness of Hong Kong, not that it is a case of this and that, or that we have experienced this and that global processes, because many other societies have experienced those processes. But what is quite unique and what we can always try to problematize is what happens when you have colonialism meeting so close, it's basically next door, and right now it's not even next door. Nationalism, national projects. Now, I use the term project instead of process to talk about capitalism and nationalism or colonialism. Because when you use the term process, it's very passive. When you talk about project, you think about who's driving the project, whose interests are being realized. You have to have agency behind projects. It's like students or researchers doing projects. There has to be an intention. There has to be resources. There have to be interest motivating it. And it could fail. Projects could fail. So I think what is interesting about Hong Kong to me is that it is a place where we can examine the articulations and the clashes of all these global projects, historical projects, diasporic projects. Hong Kong has always been a diasporic site, so diaspora coming in, they have their projects, they have their interests, intellectuals, diasporic intellectuals, fleeing mainland China to Hong Kong. Very clearly, Chinese University of Hong Kong, we're in New Asia College. That's a diasporic project. They have to do something in order to produce the institution that we come to know as New Asia College. Cosmopolitan projects, capitalists. Hamilton, what Hamilton? There are two Hamiltons, both Hamiltons actually, write about cosmopolitan, capitalist, cosmopolitan intellectuals. Dissent is another project. So I think when we think about Hong Kong's uniqueness, trying to find something that's unique to Hong Kong, we can use these historical processes, these theories from social science, but we want to not just pick one of them and make Hong Kong a case of one of them, but see how all these that are global mix and match, context with each other. And I think that is the place where we can define Hong Kong's uniqueness. And with this approach, Hong Kong's spatiality as an entity is, of course, spatially open, like in the second approach. The boundary is fluid. We would begin to see a different Hong Kong, not as a location you can point to in a map, but with all these connections with bigger, larger historical process. So Hong Kong becomes an open, fluid entity. Now, temporality, Hong Kong becomes, as a historical formation, is this depository of clashing multiple open temporalities. And to me, this is the aspect of Hong Kong that has been the least studied and maybe the most important. In what sense? I don't think there is ever a society where from the very beginning, during the colonial period, there was an end point. Hong Kong has always been called a borrowed place, borrowed time. So that, as a historical formation, people have to, what do people do with this kind of finite temporality? And then come 1997, people came, a lot of them came here because of 1997, because there was a time point, temporality, very temporal temporality of Hong Kong as a society. Which society will always have these, at some point, every now and then you have an endpoint in sight. 2047 is another endpoint. And what is so important about these endpoints is that people's sense of time in Hong Kong make them do things collectively that you may not find people would do. It gives them a different logic of action by being in Hong Kong, dealing with this temporality that is part of a dimension of Hong Kong as a historical formation. How the sense of time and society's understanding of its finite temporality, shifting temporality, affect middle class, the working class, affect politicians, affect capitalists, affect popular culture. I'm going to use 2019 movement as an example to illustrate how temporality is such an important part, motivating, driving 2019. And this is the kind of Hong Kong uniqueness that you only would come to focus on, not through theory invented in the US. Nobody would focus on that as a research subject because US society doesn't have an endpoint, right? You don't have an endpoint to say that, well, 2019 is our end game. People who know the movement know that this is the end game. This is in the frontline kids that I study. It is in their everyday conversation. It is in their heart. It is in their soul. This is what pushes them every day to risk their lives and future. It is the temporality that is so unique to Hong Kong that you cannot understand 2019 without attending to that aspect. And that made me think back, history of the present. All these mechanisms, what temporality has shifted. I was growing up when borrowed time, borrowed place defines for me Hong Kong as a society, as a weird kind of society where, I mean, what society would know itself, would come to an end, and then the uncertainty would be the defining feature of our society at that point. And these endpoints have shifted. And now I don't even know what is the endpoint. But you feel like some people have said Hong Kong has died, even though Hong Kong still exists. Again, why? Because of this temporality. And what does this temporality, Hong Kong studies have to deal with this if we want to generate knowledge that speaks to Hong Kong and is really allows Hong Kong to have a reflexive moment, if not an emancipatory moment. I'm going to say very briefly, and what time do I have? Okay. To use very briefly, 2019, let's say we're interested in studying 2019 protest, 2019, 2020. I use this as an example to illustrate the three approaches that I have presented to you. So in the first case, and I have colleagues, very well respected, my very esteemed colleagues that I admire a lot. And so by no means am I saying that this is using the first approach, Hong Kong as a case, is illegitimate. Most social scientists, myself included, have done that, is one possibility. 2019 social movement is a case of social movement. You can draw on the social movement literature to talk about mobilization, to talk about leaderless mobilization, to talk about the lack of leadership, to talk about so many things that social movement in general, any social movement analyst would want to understand. Hong Kong is a case of that. So your questions, the questions of your research, using the Hong Kong as a case approach, is to put Hong Kong 2019 in dialogue with social movement theory. Totally legitimate. I've seen brilliant work that get published in international journals, which is is a main agenda for Hong Kong academia, is to place themselves, their work, in global international channel. That's one way, very respectable, acceptable way, and necessary way to make Hong Kong studies globally relevant and significant, is to be able to put Hong Kong on the map of international scholarship. To do that, you have to engage theory. 2019 is a great case to study social movement. Nobody would dispute that. So that's the first example, the first approach. Using 2019 in the second approach, which is basically what I myself have done, is to look at it through, for instance, global China. As I said, Hong Kong's domination of China in Hong Kong parallels those that China has done to Africa to different effect. But I also study Africa's resistance and reaction to global China. And 2019 is one counter movement against global China. So I can use Hong Kong's movement against China as one data point, as one of the global tendency of anti-China. We all realize there's an anti-China global backlash. And Hong Kong's movement is part of that global backlash. And we get assistance from the US because the US was also engaged in anti-China at that point. It's part of that. And that's why the international community reacted to 2019 with support. You couldn't imagine that kind of support without a global backlash against China. So Hong Kong 2019 has to be understood as that global process. I have also colleagues who study the 2019 movement as part of other global digitized movement. Remember, at the time of 2019, around the world, Chile had this very forceful, powerful movement, popular movement, where people also use digitized media technology to mobilize large numbers against the government. Lebanon, the largest popular mobilization happened in November, while we were having this, the siege at Polyeu. The French Yellow Vest, again, no leadership, huge mobilization, prolonged movement. So Hong Kong is part of this global uprising where people rely on digitized technology. So that in itself is a global trend that we can analyze 2019 as part of that tendency. What is the third approach, the one that I'm trying to realize in my next book? Well, I asked myself, what is unique about 2019 to Hong Kong? What is so special? What were we obsessed with? Hong Kong society obsessed with during 2019? Yes, of course, it's a movement. Of course, it is anti-China. But I think when you look back, if for people who have experienced that 9-10 months, what was unique? What was so memorable and even revolutionary is our engagement with violence. Violence from the very beginning. We feared that the movement was split because of our disagreement about violence versus rule of law. This obsession with rule of law and its opposition, violence, is what runs through the whole thing, which drives people to try to form unions because we don't want more violence. We want to avoid more injuries. Was what makes some people protest, some people not to protest. It's all about violence. Our obsession with legality and its opposite, violence. This is what I want to, or at least part of what my book would deal with. Why are we so obsessed with violence? And what is so unique about 2019? Coming out of 2019 and 2020, Hong Kong people, most Hong Kong people, have a totally different understanding of violence. And not just physical violence, but we're enlightened to see violence that we didn't see before and fight against it. I'm talking about institutional violence, the criminal justice system. Nobody now believes the police. And this is a critique, not just about physical violence, police violence, but the entire criminal justice system. We see violence in institution. An institution could inflict so much violence without smearing our faces on the ground, as the police did. We also see market violence. Capitalism is violent, and that's why the new labor movement that grew out of the movement. Yes, they form unions. I follow these unions. I talk to them. I went to their meetings. I talked to them a lot. And what I realized was the motivation was not just to form unions. They came to a very deep critique of the violence of the market. And this is revolutionary in the sense that I've never seen. Hong Kong people never reflect on the violence of the market. Market rationality has been so deep-seated. So these all cohere into the theme of violence that has to be dealt with and understood if we had to understand the historical significance or even the historical evolution of 2019. But if you look at social movement theories, if you look at all these macro processes, nobody would, well, not nobody, but it's hard to see how to center violence as the subject of your study through which to see 2019 as both movement, as revolution, as anti-China, as anti-decolonization struggle. So what I'm trying to say here is that these three approaches would, and also the end game, the temporality, was front and center for those in the front line, if not those at the back as well. And so temporality is what drove the movement. We don't have more time anymore if we don't put all into this movement to fight against China. 2047, Hong Kong will disappear. So this is a time the last time, the last stand we could pull off. And in the most radical of the radicals, this is what motivates them. Well, there are other motivations, but temporality, the politics of time. And so I think if we adopt a third approach, we begin to talk about global theories, global histories, through a very important, locally specific, experientially Hong Kong kind of starting point to inform our theorization, to inform our history. I would have to go back, in my writing, I have to go back to Hong Kong's colonial history, British colonial history, to understand our obsession with the law, to understand our kind of knee-jerk reaction against violence, any form of violence, any form of confrontation. And that has to do with colonialism, but also communism at our doorstep. Our experience of 1967, and since then, because Hong Kong people have experienced so much bomb, my father's generation, they declare that they will never accept violence in Hong Kong, any violence. And that kind of obsession, going overboard, extreme obsession, has historical roots with colonialism clashing with the national project of China, Communist project of China. And again, so 2019, we need to trace all the way back to our history. Sorry, I need to finish up. So those are the three approaches, three ways to make Hong Kong globally relevant and significant. And there may be other options, but so far, given my limited ability, I could only come up with three. I want to go through very quickly about the politics of doing global Hong Kong studies and the practice. We're not alone that we have to deal with politics even when we are just producing knowledge in university setting, very safe, well protected, with money, research money. Politics all the time shapes what we produce as scholars, the knowledge of what is being produced, knowledge that is being erased, being marginalized. These are all politics that we know as students and scholars. And so Hong Kong studies under siege, under assault, in Hong Kong itself, globally, historically, is not unique. I say this as a matter of fact, not to comfort ourselves or feel good about the challenges that we're dealing with, but we need to borrow and learn from other people's experience, how other fields of studies have to tackle these political intervention. No, I'll go very quickly. All these fields of studies, from anthropology's connection and area studies connection to colonialism, women's studies connection to feminism in society. The feminist movement basically pushed feminist studies, women's studies into the university and make it regular curriculum. So it's social movement generating, engendering a field of knowledge. Colonialism with money from the government, British colonialism and US imperialism give us money to do area studies, sponsor PhD students. Racial justice movement now pushing universities to mainstream race studies. Sociology in China has been abolished after communists took power because that branch of knowledge was unacceptable to the party, too challenging, subversive to the party. So we have experienced before, the entire field of knowledge was eliminated, was banned. But in China, until the opening that recover sociology. Of course, China was following USSR, I think it was 1952, in banning sociology. And it's now revived, and it's now under siege again. China studies, in China, again, the best China studies has happened not in China, but in the West. So all these are examples where, politics always interfere. Politics can also facilitate and become an enabler of knowledge production. Taiwan studies, Korean studies, Jewish studies, Armenian studies, all these are now in major universities as centers of research or even as departments. Why? Well, because the diaspora have pooled resources, don't use donation, endowment as a venue to mainstream the area studies that they care about. And this is something I hope people with resource who care about Hong Kong could think of doing. It has been done by other diaspora, by governments who've been marginalized. Taiwan has done tremendous work and have made tremendous stride in mainstreaming Taiwan studies and providing resources for that. African studies, because I spent so much time in Africa, I just so realized that African studies has been so marginalized because there's not enough political economic interest in the whole continent, which is so rich in other ways. Politics also, not at this macro level, at the state and market or society level, but within universities, there's a whole sort of micro politics that shape what is being offered. Libraries, I mean, to look at that, we have this privilege of having a dedicated library to Hong Kong studies, which I hope to see more around the world. And this is politics. You have space, you have activities. We can host activities, we can bring people together to grow that field of study. Publishing, of course, we need fellowships to support students pursuing that. We need money to endow positions, faculty positions, so that Hong Kong studies could emulate the experience of Japan studies, Korea studies, to have its own continuous academic line to preserve, to make it sustainable, and not just somebody die or retire, then it's disappear. Publishers, to make publishers interested in Hong Kong studies. Field formation, recognition. So I, together with quite a few scholars in Hong Kong, we several years ago formed a Society for Hong Kong Studies, and we have activities. You guys can go on the web to find us. We formed that societies. We've sponsored awards, international awards, paper and book awards for Hong Kong studies. Once the people get these awards, these awards could help with their career and motivate other people to develop a knowledge about Hong Kong. So all these involve politics and resources and money. In terms of prices, I think this is the worst of times for Hong Kong studies, but also the best of times. The worst of times is easy to understand. There is a tremendous pressure to nationalize Hong Kong studies, that is to subordinate Hong Kong within the national schema of things, both in terms of erasing Hong Kong's history and subsume it under the broader nationalist narrative. A lot of people from the mainland or with mainland interest have made it their project to rewrite Hong Kong history textbooks about Hong Kong. But on the other hand, I've never seen so much global interest in Hong Kong because of 2019, as a matter of fact, since 2014, when umbrella movement broke out. So social movements ushered Hong Kong into the global map of scholarship and academic interest, like women's movement put feminism on the map as well. So yes, we're dealing with very forceful national or nationalistic interest to erase Hong Kong as having its own history or rewrite it according to the nationalist project and narrative. But on the other hand, we're seeing really a mushrooming of interest globally. There is an exodus of students and scholars from Hong Kong. And people would worry that, well, who will stay in Hong Kong to do Hong Kong studies? I think unless there is really a 100% seal off of the border, there has bound to be some circulation. It may diminish the circulation, the flow, but there has to be. I'm editing for Cambridge University Press this book series on global China. And what I'm realizing was that if you look at global China, it's not a contemporary phenomenon. Even in Maoist China, there have been so many global traffic in journalism, in dance, in ballet, in music, in trade, technology transfer, that we're rediscovering all these global flows from China with the rest of the world. What is the lesson to us? That is in an age that we thought Mao was in total control and insulate the country from the rest of the world. It wasn't the case if we look carefully. And what I can then project into the future is that there may be more restrictions of Hong Kong becoming a global member of this and that community, including the academic communities, for students and scholars. That's almost certain to happen with what's going on in China now. But it won't evaporate into nothing. So those limited circulation, we need to take advantage of and preserve and protect and promote. The proliferation of Hong Kong Studies program, you can go to this website, you see we have partners. Me, myself, and other colleagues at the University of California has formed this global Hong Kong Studies program at UC. We have regular activities for a whole year online. And every time we have activities, we have between 1,000 to 200 people registering and showing up. So there's a huge demand, and we're very grateful for that reception. But we have partners in Singapore. There's a Hong Kong Research Hub in Singapore NSU. We have partners in in the UK University, Bristol. Is it Bristol? I hope I'm talking. See, my partner will punish me later. But a Hong Kong study program. And then here is another. And then we have Society for Hong Kong Studies. I'm blinking out on some other, of course, Liu Xin, Canada's UBC Hong Kong initiative. We form a nexus, and we will have conference in the future. We hope to maintain that network of overseas bases for Hong Kong studies and trying to do Hong Kong studies that will be globally significant and relevant. Archives and collections. I know people are trying to build, this is a very good example, the first, I hope, of many to come, to have archives, digital archives, or physical archives and collections of materials from Hong Kong. Teaching and publishing. So I want to say we're not alone. The erosion of academic freedom, which Hong Kong, of course, feels very strongly and urgently, is not just a Hong Kong phenomenon. Everywhere, academic freedom is either eroded by authoritarianism or by market forces. We look at all our own universities. It's the market that determines how we deal with students, how we teach, what we teach. So either way, we'll never have this pristine utopian space where we only care about knowledge. That's the goal, but it has never been the reality. So in that sense, the moment that we live now, the things we have to do, has always been the norm, that we always have to find and fight for our own space to do the kind of knowledge that is emancipatory for some group of people. And I hope for doing global Hong Kong studies, that group of people, that community is Hong Kong. And from that, we use our indigenous insider knowledge to reach out to global knowledge, reach out to global processes, understand Hong Kong through those processes, but also to reach out to the global through theories, through international scholarship. And I think that echoes very well what Bernard has already said, I think 2008 at that time, and that was his vision. What I'm doing today is echoing you, Bernard, but giving it more flesh and more kind of specific elaboration on the way to move forward. And by no means have I given you exhaustive ideas, but I should stop, and I'm sorry. I've gone overboard, 45 minutes, and I look forward to comments from our discussants. Thank you.
So many times I want to cut you off, but I think the audience would not be happy if I do.
Oh, by the way, I should show this. This is my last slide, see? Ideas. We're in a business of producing ideas, so we should, this is what we do, echoing the frontline militants, brothers and sisters. I'd like to stay with this, if you don't mind.
Thank you, CK. And talking about temporality, I'm going to introduce a different kind of temporality as I introduce our two discussants. Temporality in terms of we have 3 generations of Hong Kongers on our panel. And if CK and myself put ourselves in the middle,
Not the
we
oldest.
have, as the middle generation, we have the earlier generation of Hong Kongers, Winnie. And then we also have our newer generation of Hong Kongers, or someone of Hong Kong background, Vincent, to be our discussant. So very quickly, Dr. Winnie Ng is Chair Emeritus, Unifor Sam Gindin Chair in Social Justice and Democracy of the Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson. And prior to her appointment at the former Ryerson University, she was the Canadian Labour Congress Ontario Regional Director for 8 years, and also an executive member of the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance. Winnie has extensive experience in the social justice field in Canada with a very strong reputation. Yes, I'm aware of time, and we have a little bit of time. So let's not do the end game thing. With a strong reputation for building broad alliance across different sectors and also sides of social justice. And then we have Vincent. So before I ask Winnie to come up, so yes, please. Vincent is now currently a PhD candidate at Osgoode Law School of York University. He is also on the advisory committee of the Community Justice Collective in the GTA. And also a member of the Lausanne Collective, which is a leftist group of writers, researchers, activists, and artists from Hong Kong and the diaspora. And he was also an adjunct professor and the William Graham Research Associate with the International Human Rights Center at the University of Hong Kong, and he's going to be University of Toronto. Yes. Thank you. And then he's going to be the assistant professor at University of Windsor, also faculty of law. So, thank you.
Thank you, CK, for the presentation, and thank you very much. Is this sound okay? I'm very honored to be here, and thank you, Renita, for the invitations. I guess I'll put on my other hat as the chairperson of the Toronto Association for Democracy in China. We owe an everlasting debt of gratitude to the late Dr. Bernard Luk. As you know, York University, right next outside the Students' Union building, there's the Goddess of Democracy statue that we go every year to present the wreath. And we owe, Dr. Bernard Luk was the one who did all the invisible work behind the scene, the heavy lifting with the York University administration for the successful installations of the statue. So this is my tribute to him. I think to me, I think this whole conversation, and CK, thank you for adding on this piece. It's like a breath of fresh air in this dark and dangerous time when many of our friends and comrades are either in exile or in jail in Hong Kong as political prisoners. So just a bit of my background is I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I came to Canada as a foreign student in 1968 at the age of 17. So you do the math. I'm 71. So I came, really as a naive youngster under the colonial education system. And so most of my political growing up, awakening started and took root in Canada. And I come out as a union organizer. So I guess my comments today will be more from a social justice activist. I see myself, compared to most of you, I'm a late comer into the academy. I did my PhD back in the early 50s. So I'm coming to this point more as an academic activist and provide some of the comments. I really endorse CK's stance about the globalizing Hong Kong studies. It's not just about Hong Kong, but put in the larger context of history, theory, and the world. In globalizing Hong Kong studies, we are lifting the place beyond national, regional boundaries and or any other externally imposed borders. And I think it's important to complicate it with critical intersectioning lenses and transform it into an enriched space for theory and practice. So I have a couple of comments. It's in terms of just to adding on, deepening it, is in examining the subject matter of Hong Kong, what's Hong Kong, I believe it's equally important to reflect on the notion of who a Hong Konger is. And for me, you know, with my own history and activism and my locations, I see myself in the Canadian context. I see myself as a Chinese Canadian, as an Asian Canadian. And then the 2014 umbrella movement and the 2019 pro-democracy movement have jolted me into reflecting on what does it mean to be born and raised in Hong Kong and who a Hong Konger is. And if we push it further with all the people that are either coming in, if, you know, seeking refugee status and all that, what would a Hong Kong diaspora community look like and sound like and feel like? What are some of our shared visions or missions, if there's one? And to me, I think this is where, how do we, particularly in the North American context, how do we unpack the multiple and intersecting identities of Hong Kongers? How can we contextualize it as what bell hooks refer as in the interlocking systems of dominations? So to me, I think it's important we center on earlier, CK talked about the violence, as a theoretical frame. To me, I think it's also important to focus on those who are bearing the brunt of the violence, who are the casualties of, be it market violence, economic violence, police, and other brutalities. What made them to get up, stand up, resist, and engage in civil disobedience, right? So I would like to see more, as I see research as an organizing tool, I would like to see more action research process under the global Hong Kong studies. It's important to center on those personal narratives. It's just like, I would see the comparison, that analogy as the Lennon War phenomena, right? There's a very famous slogans in the Lennon War. It's never too small to say something loud. And to me, each Hong Kong person or each protesters have so much to say in standing up and taking up their belief into actions. The other piece, so I mean, sort of my dream and imagining the global Hong Kong studies would be like, there should be Hong Kong studies, global Hong Kong studies around the globe, like just like the Lennon War, right? And I think that would be a very beautiful sight. CK earlier talked about, the second point is on the sustainability of Hong Kong studies in institutions with a dominant Eurocentric narrative, right? We know the politics. And universities, as CK has mentioned earlier, it's very much market-driven. It's under constant threat of austerity and neoliberal agenda. Universities in Canada, at least, are still public institutions. So, and we're no different from others. We're basically recruiting international students as a revenue-generating strategy. And here I'll just share a really small example in a university that would remain unnamed. 2017, after the death of Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobo, the Toronto community came together, we raised money, and we retained one of our renowned Canadian sculptor to do the empty chair, a bronze cast empty chair statue as a memorial, a tribute to the late Liu Xiaobo. We offered as a gift to this particular universities, and they turned us down with the flimsiest excuse, it's inexcusable, that this might jeopardize their scholarly exchange with China, and that it might jeopardize the safety and the visa of the Canadian professors and students going there. Oh, you're pointing already, okay. So while it is an intellectual space, to me, I think the studies, it's also a disruptive space within the academy. And to me, I think that's where the public engagement becomes such a key component in forging new partnership and support. And I see the Hong Kong study as a community, but also as a broaden beyond the campus. We talk about outside in, and how do we bring in inside out? Sorry, we talk about inside out, but how do we bring in the outside in? So that's as a part of the this dissemination of knowledge. And I fully agreed, like I have it all the notes here about the archival, the clearinghouse for personal narratives and historical documentations. We see how easily history can be erased. I would like to suggest that we have an activist archives. The documentations of the Independent Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions. Over the 30 years, their struggle, founded in 1990, the struggles, the achievements, the victories they have done, that shouldn't be dissolved and forgotten and replaced by something else. And I think that's part of Hong Kong working class history. And we need to preserve it so the new generations of labor organizers in Hong Kong and overseas would know that who were there to clear the paths. Okay, lastly, then the other piece is, as Professor had said, ideas are bulletproof. It can also be bullet point as well, Freudian slip. Yeah. And to me, I think, to add on that, resistance are expressions of such ideas, right? And resistance take place in different spheres, in different form, beyond protests and direct actions and rallies. Ideas are germinated through knowledge productions, through our mentoring, through our teaching, through our scholarship and public engagement. So the stronger the suppressions, the more creative we need to be in pushing for that space, in breaking that crack, in subverting and directing for truth-telling and for the next generations of activists to come. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be invited to be in this space, a really, really important space that is this Hong Kong Library at the University of Toronto is such a treasure and has so much symbolic significance that we are able to have this discussion about global Hong Kong studies in such a shining beacon that exemplifies those values and this opportunity. And of course, to share a panel here with Professor Lee and Winnie Ng, who've worked together for a long time now. So I'm going to cross four sort of points, ideas or bullet points. And first, kind of situating myself, because I think this is very interesting how, I'll start by saying, and I said this a couple of times now, in different contexts, is that we know that this conversation here and similar conversations about global Hong Kong studies would be criminalized and targeted and shut down by the national security law in Hong Kong as we speak. In other words, we cannot have this particular conversation, at least in this particular way, in Hong Kong anymore. And I said this exact same thing when I was teaching a critical race theory seminar to folks in New York as I was working with the African American Policy Forum over about a year on tracking and responding to the campaign of racial justice, education, repression under the so-called anti-critical race theory campaigns that are happening in America that have resulted in the firing of teachers and the pulling of books on racial injustice and slavery from the shelves of libraries in America today. And of course, you know, CK, I'm sure you know, at UCLA, it's such a famous hub of critical race studies that we all have a connection to this in a small world. And the third thing is, of course, I used to work here at the University of Toronto at the International Human Rights Program, and we had our director, our proposed director, the directorship interfered with and shut down by a sitting federal court judge on behalf of Zionist lobbyists and a former Israeli national security advisor, and actually resulted in a long kind of academic boycott of the University of Toronto. But here we are again in a different context, and I just wanted to extend that idea of we are not alone, you know, really. I mean, this is really, really close to home, this stuff, right? We have another field, yet again, under siege by nationalist repression, right? And it might be a different party that does it, but by, you know, the effects feel pretty similar. So the second, going back, and maybe Professor Lee, you've already, you know, heard this to death of around area studies, right? So I'm very interested in what makes your conceptualization of this global assemblage's approaches to Hong Kong different than other area studies. Are you trying to make an intervention into area studies, that this is how area studies ought to be, or is there something kind of you're proposing that is unique, or ought it to be unique? I guess that's the question to your formulation of global Hong Kong studies, and why. Is the idea that Hong Kong is inherently global, does that, you know, run the risk, let's say, of privileging this type of approach as only to be occupied Hong Kong, or is it something that is a way to make area studies better? And then I'm thinking about, you know, perhaps the ideas of connected sociologies. I believe is Gurminder Bamba, that has been talking about this idea as a way to, one, to destabilize Eurocentrism in sociology, but also to foreground colonial histories and to make it much less about Europe and the West and everybody else, right, in academic formulation, but rather to talk about these things as things that have the same temporality, that have common histories, that had produced each other, influenced each other as they were coming up as ideas and politics. So that's about area studies. The third one is a more, I guess, direct critique on global. Like, does global Hong Kong studies need to necessarily foreground global? What can putting the global nature, and I think about this in terms of repression under the national security law, right? There's a contingency about what is criminalized under national security law in terms of education. So not everything, right, in Hong Kong studies in Hong Kong is criminalized by national security law, right? So you could talk lots about many global things as it pertains to Hong Kong: collaboration on global trade, corporate finance, cultural exchange, various government issues, certainly policing, right? But not certain things, right? Certain things are definitely offside, and I would say that's anything that could be critical or perceived to be critical by the nexus of power in Hong Kong, particularly as it relates to the party state in China. So, given that the national security law is and others are providing this filtering, is it a more useful orientation to say something like critical Hong Kong studies that has an implicit global orientation, and does this, you know, maybe mitigate some of the concern around knowledge production and representation between local and diaspora? Because of course, global Hong Kong studies is happening in the diaspora, right? Largely. It does have a circulation with local scholars, but as this, if money is put into this, does it run the risk of sidelining local voices in terms of knowledge production and resources for things that may not be necessarily repressed, let's say, by the national security law? And does that run a risk? And so the final thing I'll say, and this loops back to the first thing, is what ought to be then the orientation of global Hong Kong studies to other fields under siege. As you mentioned, they have really a global erosion of academic freedom, rising censorship, self-censorship in the age of global autocratization and marketization. You know, I think there is the immediate need to globalize Hong Kong studies. I think post-national security law is clear and obvious to everyone here. And then with that in mind, what is the type of critical scholarship and discussion that those censored by truth regimes in different contexts ought to be having with each other, right? And it will obviously look different in a place like Hong Kong and China as opposed to, say, here in North America. What is the orientation and the discussions that Hong Kong studies has to be having with, let's say, Palestine studies or critical race studies? We don't see very much, I think, mutual discussion there, and that might be an opportunity that ought to be pursued further. And so, yeah, that's all I have to say, but thank you very much for your amazing presentation, and thank you all for being here.
Should we open up, because I can respond to these comments while because there are so many people in the room. I like to hear what people say. Gordon.
Okay, I just want to mention very quickly when we talk about global Hong Kong.
Do you want to give the mic or just?
I just want to comment very quickly when we speak of global Hong Kong studies. I need to point out to you, because having been the program coordinator of East Asian Studies for many years at York, regional studies programs here in North America are under siege. York has attempted a number of times to get rid of East Asian studies. They've gotten rid of other area studies. And this is something we need to push back. I've had to dig my heels in. And fortunately, we have enough enrollment that the department, the faculty cannot justify getting rid of East Asian studies. They have gotten rid of other area studies, once again, the marketization, how many bumps you have in the seat, et cetera, et cetera. And also, Winnie, one comment about the statue, the goddess of democracy statue
Yes.
at York, it was actually moved. It used to be in front of the student center, and because of a request from somewhere, it was put behind.
Ah, thank you. Yes, yes. It's a bit in a more obscure location. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Based on what you have said, I'd like to
Can you say who you are?
Yeah, my name is Frank from Malaysia.
From
Malaysia,
Malaysia.
to Canada via USA, study at Cornell. Dr. Lee, a few years ago before the pandemic, spoke at the Asian Institute on campus on Hong Kong frontiers of China nationalism, or globalization, sorry. That's the Mount Center called a School of Global Affairs. And outside that building is a garden. And that garden is named for a person. And that person, I didn't know his name until now, it's David Eves Bossequet. This guy worked for Jardine Matheson for 20 years, just before the Japanese invaded Hong Kong. And then it continued after the occupation left. They worked there for 20 years before they left Hong Kong for good and returned to England. And he had a daughter. And the daughter named that garden for his father. And that daughter is Melanie Bossequet, who married Peter Monk, who is the Canadian founder of the Barrick Gold Company that destroyed a lot of environment and people's livelihood based in Toronto. So that garden dedicated to his father to kind of whitewash his father's name, the plaque made the point that this guy worked for Jardine Matheson, a renowned Far East trading company. It says nothing about the Opium Wars and the colonization of British Hong Kong.
So because of time, so I ask people to keep your question brief, so that CK has the opportunity to respond.
What about
Other question?
what about online? We have an online audience. Online people, they don't ask questions? Okay.
Don't have that.
Hi, I'm from the political science department here. I have a question actually related to Vincent's comment. So Vincent's interpretation of your third approach is like area studies. But from your 2019 example of theorizing of how Hong Kong people awaken to the idea of violence, they become more critical of some forms of institutional violence, violence of the capital system that a lot of people have not previously considered. To me, that does not sound exactly like area studies. That sounds like theorizing. And so that makes me feel like the first approach and the third approach are more porous than they seem. So the first approach,
Of course,
sounds like to me like, you're taking a theory that's derived somewhere, and you apply it to the case of Hong Kong. You use Hong Kong as a case to try to advance that theory. But the third approach, with the example that you raised, it sounds to me like you're using deep knowledge of Hong Kong to theorize that it is still an exercise of theorization. So to me, the first and third sound quite similar, just that just in the first case, the theory does not come from Hong Kong. In the third case, the theory comes from Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Just
Sure.
some clarification on that, that relates to Vincent's comment.
Great.
Thank you. My name is Jack Leung, so thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Professor Lee. And I had a question on behalf of the students and junior scholars. So can you also comment on the publishing opportunities and the prospect of job for using some of your amazing approach to study Hong Kong? So, thank you.
Anyone last question?
Depends on the market.
Sure.
Not so much, I'm Gindin Man, part of the executive committee organizing this session. Not so much a question, this is a comment in regard to sort of third proposal that you have. If it's theory building, which, it's, I'm not sure whether it is or not, but anyway, in terms of conducting research as a researcher myself, I know that, institutions such as the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, your proposal need to be theory, led by mainstream theory or alternative theory, any kind of theory. You need to have a strong theoretical perspective. And so therefore, if we conduct research which sort of, appears to be not very theoretically vigorous, then we likely won't be able to get any grants. So there's a catch-22 there. But so what you're proposing, I guess, is that we need to have endowment, and so it's like reliant on other kind of funding institutions, which is not the mainstream kind of institution. So that can be a problem. Thank you.
He has a. You have a question, no?
Oh, actually,
Yeah, I think he.
So actually, sorry, Mitchell. So I'm supposed to be the.
And who are you?
I'm like a student library assistant, supposed to help with the talk here, but Dr. talk is really amazing. So I just have some questions for you and Vincent and Winnie too. So I guess it's something like Bill and Vincent talked about, like the problem with like Hong Kong studies, probably not unique to Hong Kong studies. Like academia in general, I think like that quite a bit of attack of misinformation around the public on like current events or just like historical information. So I was wondering if like Dr. Lee, Vincent and Winnie, do you guys have any like advice on how academics like us can help like dispel some misinformation that is propagated around the public about Hong Kong? And in the same time, like, because most of the people I know that's interested in Hong Kong studies mainly from Hong Kong itself. So, but like, I think in order for, maybe I'm being naive, I think like for Hong Kong studies to be sustainable, like I think there should be more interest from outside of Hong Kong, like maybe like regular Canadians, like Americans, or like Koreans and Japanese, or even like people from mainland China. So I was wondering, do you guys have any like advice on how we can garner the support to like further develop the discipline? And that's it.
Thank you. If I may abuse my my position as the moderator, I have one question very quickly. You mentioned about the subject. That's your third approach, Hong Kong as defining Hong Kong subject. And my question is along the line of what Winnie asked is, who is the subject? Because this subject is not unitary. And so,
of course.
And then how, so then when we define it and when, then the approach, even talking about the violence, as you mentioned, using 2019 as the case, depending on, because Hong Kong is not one
of course
subject, so then that is how to unpack and construct that as well.
Okay, I can start with the last one in reverse order of all these questions. Thank you very much, they're great. I never said that there's only one unitary subject in Hong Kong. That would be ridiculous to say that. And the example I use is just one example. I'm saying that I'm not suggesting that I can tell you what are worthy of being researched. I'm just saying that if you're interested in 2019, how would the three approaches look like? Using that as an example, and that's my interest right now. I'm writing a book about it. So, but of course you can talk about the the Hong Kong diaspora. You can talk about any subject related to Hong Kong. And by no means did I say that, well, Hong Kong is one and there's one movement and that's how we approach global Hong Kong studies. No, I mean the subject matter is up to you to choose and how you divide and conceptualize Hong Kong people, Hong Kong community in, of course, plurals all the time. So I don't know, I'm making, I'm not making any statement about Hong Kong being one subject, or I'm saying that putting Hong Kong as the subject of our inquiry. And that relates to the second last question. Exactly because we want other people to be interested in Hong Kong, that's why we make it global. Otherwise, only people who were born in Hong Kong will be interested in Hong Kong, and then we are in a really terrible, serious trouble then, because it becomes nativist, that only Hong Kong people can understand Hong Kong, only Hong Kong people can study Hong Kong, which, by the way, some of the race studies scholars have that kind of extreme nativist position, which I'm totally against. I don't believe you have to be a black person to understand black experience, but it's very popular now, these kind of positions these days, and I'm totally against it. The same way, we don't want Hong Kong studies to become a field of knowledge that only attracts people from Hong Kong or in Hong Kong. And so how do we get people interested? Outside of Hong Kong, interested in Hong Kong? We need to show the global relevance of Hong Kong. And I don't think it's as bleak as you seem to suggest. Because Hong Kong has 150 or more years of being a global city. I can give you a lot of examples where Hong Kong has been visited by so many people. At one point or another, they spend a little bit of time, their parents or their siblings. So when 2019 came around, the global reaction, the support, was not just because of the media report around the clock. It's also because a lot of people has actually spent time in Hong Kong in their professional life, or the family had connections there. I just look at people around me, and people who have the power to push through the Hong Kong Democracy Human Rights Act. Guess who was pushed? Well, of course, those senators that we all know, but their aides, the congressional aides. I talked to people who actually did the lobbying. The congressional aides were the most significant people. They have their book. If you have been to the Hill, you know. They give you 15 minutes. Their notebook is after 15 minutes, any issue around the world, you have 15 minutes to push your case. And their notebook, the congressional aid book, is the agenda for their bosses. And so these congressional aides, I talked to them and they said, they are so in love with Hong Kong because they've spent time there. Actually, people have spent time there, and it is their personal investment into the process. And so Hong Kong as a global city has built up a lot of social capital over decades and centuries. And so we need to keep that going. Now that people are leaving, there's an exodus. But I think the misinformation, learn from my subject in the movement. These guys, they fight in the front line, but you know what? On the keyboard, they also have their own propaganda war, and they target those netizens back home. They would talk, the Hong Kong youth would talk to people online on the other side of the border and tell them what is happening in Hong Kong that is not the same as in the official press. So we can all fight against misinformation, because these days you can talk to a lot of people through your social media. Now, global Hong Kong studies, is it area studies? What's the relationship between area studies and all these other different kinds of studies? I don't really feel like I have much to say about all these categories, these labels. And I think I understand, these labels are important, because they preserve, that's where our institutional space come from. If you have an East Asian Studies department, then people studying Hong Kong or East Asia will have the resources. But what I'm talking about, most part of my talk, I talk about how, regardless of which department or your professional identity, your actual scholarship, the actual production of knowledge, how do you do research, how do you approach, or how to come up with a research topic. And this answers some of the question. Whether my study falls under approach 1 or approach 3, that's not important. They're not mutually exclusive. What distinguishes number 3 is really, first, how you decide what to study. What do you see that should be studied? Do you see a social movement only, like other cases of social movement in 2019, which is the first approach of people, this is a social movement. I study it from a social movement theoretical perspective, contribute to social movement theory. Second approach, I study it as part of global China. I contribute to understanding of this global process called global China. But the third, you ask question, what is the Hong Kong experience in 2019 that is significant for Hong Kong's own history? And violence is one of the things that I think is very important to understand the nature of Hong Kong, not just at that moment, but in the past, how people have been shaped by colonialism to see that stark contrast, that the law is not violent. Physical, the bomb is violence. We have never had an occasion until 2019 to have such a large number of people collectively reflect on and reject what the colonial regime has sort of socialized us into, observing that boundary. 2019, how many people of all ages have crossed that colonial blind-sightedness? That is, the category of the political has basically been transformed in 2019. Violence is being one of them. What is political? The market is political. The workplace is political. The law is political. Police is political. Violence is political. And this is what post-colonial studies means. So I think it's in how you approach a phenomenon. 2019 is a phenomenon everybody knows has existed, has happened from a scholarly perspective, when you produce knowledge about 2019, the third approach has this orientation of, from the beginning, how you define this phenomenon. That's why I say finding and defining Hong Kong. You don't need to define 2019? Yes, you need to, because it affects how, as a scholar, you produce knowledge about this thing. It is not like, oh, 2019 is one fixed thing. It is many different possible things depending on how you approach it. And so my suggestion is a scholarly approach. It's strictly for scholars. I don't see they have any usefulness for somebody like Winnie, who's an activist. But it is a very important distinction. It may sound minor if you don't do research, you don't realize it. But if you're actually writing dissertation, writing books about 2019, those are the key decisions that will generate very different knowledge. A book about violence, or a book about social movement theory, or a book about global China. See? So this is, and why do I see value in the third position? Because I want Hong Kong people to see their own history that is on something that they themselves feel important. The whole society was talking about day and night during those months, what violence means. Can we still support the movement when they trash the windows? It was a societal level discussion about violence. So that is the point I want to make. I'm not suggesting the three approaches are mutually exclusive. No, we always, of course, use theory. We always will historicize. This is in the slide on the third approach, centering, historicizing, theorizing Hong Kong. So the point about critical versus global. For me, scholarship to be useful has to be critical. So I never thought that it has to be a distinct category. But the global part needs to be built in because, after all, in most people's mind, Hong Kong is a small place. Hong Kong studies means studying that 7 million plus people, that little place on the map. And that's why I think the boundary is something that we need to be worried about if we want to globalize Hong Kong studies, is to, through our scholarship, show that Hong Kong is not this bounded place. And there are so many different ways through theory and history. We sort of remove or blur that limitation of thinking of Hong Kong as a fixed kind of reified entity. So that's why the global part is very important. Of course, that kind of global Hong Kong knowledge can be put in dialogue with Palestinian studies, Black studies, and any kinds of studies. But in order to have dialogue with others, you have to build your own studies first in order to have meaningful conversation with others. Ren is wanting me to wrap up, so I need to stop. Thank you very much for all these wonderful questions.
So even though I said we would end this early, but you can say we didn't. We don't. It is now right on time at 1 p.m. And so now I have to rush Professor Lee to eat and then to go to the airport. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And the conversation continues. And I hope this is just the beginning of a long conversation. Thank you.
Lots of time.